Thank you, Martina. Good afternoon, everyone. I am, in fact, the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the PRI, and we're working very hard to make sure we redefine what responsible investment officers do at PRI, and of course, you are all part of that change. I'm also a member of the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, and I'm the Rapporteur for the taxonomy. And I'm pleased to say that, like many of us, after 2 decades of work or more in this field, we're at the stage finally of designing the detail of the sustainable financial system we're all striving for. And today our panel will discuss a truly significant program of policy reforms on sustainable finance in Europe. Reforms that can help set the financial system on a path to sustainability and economies on a path to sustainable growth. Now, you'll be familiar with the extensive work of the high-level expert group on sustainable finance, and hopefully you are also familiar with the action plan on sustainable finance from the Commission. And we're going to discuss the detail of that action plan today. Now, as we do, some of these policies are activating people's minds very much, taxonomy being one of them, and that's fantastic because we are at this detailed design moment. This community has a special opportunity. These reform moments do not come along every day. We must work diligently and rigorously to design the detail of these reforms, and this group has very good access to that conversation, and so we should seize it, and we should use all of our intellect and preference for markets of ideas as we do it. But it's important that while we do, we must remember one thing. We must seize this broader opportunity to lay that foundation of sustainable system reform that we've all been working towards for so long. So we must support the direction of these reforms. We must be constructive and positive as we refine them. And please see this panel today as an opportunity to take that conversation to the next level. So I'd like to invite our panellists to the stage, please. We're very lucky to have the head of unit from the European Commission's DG FISMA, who's really leading the implementation of the action plan inside the Commission. He's also the Commission Chair of the Technical Expert Group, and that's Martin Spolc. Martin, please join us. Save your applause till the end. Oh, go ahead. We also have a member of the European Parliament. I think you know this person very well. It's Molly Scott Cato. Molly's the Parliamentary Rapporteur on the taxonomy and a widely respected long-term servant of the Parliament on environmental and economic issues. We also have 2 members of the Technical Expert Group. The first is Nancy Saich, who is working on the taxonomy and is the Chief Climate Change Expert at the European Investment Bank. And finally, we have Ayla Aho, who is Rapporteur for the Green Bond Standard Group of the TEG and also Executive Advisor, Sustainability at the Nordic-based European Bank, Nordea. Okay, welcome everyone. Now, it's self-serve slides in this session, Martin, so you're going to be up first, so we need to give you the clicker, which is down the other end there. So Martin is, as I say, driving these reforms inside the Commission, so he's going to explain what he's doing, and then we'll move on to a discussion.
Thank you very much, Nathan, and good afternoon to everyone. I should say that I'm not alone. I am privileged to have not only a great team of colleagues inside the European Commission, but I'm also very privileged to have a great team coming from the private sector, from the civil societies, and also, a great dialogue we have with the co-legislators. Now, I do confirm that sustainable finance is very, very high on the agenda in the European Commission, but I would like to start with a kind of bigger picture. Sustainability is a key priority for the European Commission, and we have mainstream sustainability in many of our policies already. You see climate and energy, environment, investment and growth, and recently also sustainable finance. The Sustainable Finance Project was born under the chapeau of the Capital Markets Union. But now it has grown so much that we have even dedicated an extra separate unit. As a proof that the Commission is very serious about sustainability and wants to lead the global efforts on sustainability, I would like to draw your attention to a very important document that the College of Commissioners will adopt tomorrow. They have not yet decided, but I do hope that the document that you will see tomorrow will actually set a very, very high ambition on the fight against climate change. The European Commission is going to propose a very clear plan on how to achieve carbon neutrality, hopefully by 2050, and also will explain the challenges that will be accompanying us on the path and what needs to be done also between now and 2050. This document will also set the right scene for the dialogue with stakeholders on how to overcome those challenges and also on the role of sustainable finance on that path. Nathan mentioned the action plan on sustainable finance that the College of the Commissioners adopted earlier in March. I should only comment the excellent work that had been done by the high-level expert group chaired by Christian Timman. The substance that this group delivered by far exceeded our expectations, so we were very lucky and very privileged to have a very rich material. It was not that difficult actually to work with such an excellent material. The plan that we adopted in March is a very comprehensive plan. It doesn't only propose several legislative actions, but it also proposes several other actions where we encourage stakeholders to take an active involvement, because we don't believe that sustainable finance can be a project that can be led and done only from Brussels. Let me just recall, this is a very complex slide that you see in front of you, but let me just recall the three big objectives that we have defined, not only for ourselves, but also for yourself. The first objective is reorienting capital flows. This is what we mean by shifting the trillions, not only billions. My Vice President Dombrovskis always quotes the magic number of 180 billion euros, which is a number that demonstrates the investment needs or the investment gap that we need to close to meet just the climate and energy challenges, the ambitious climate and energy goals. This number is the very minimum number. The needs are very likely much higher than that, but that demonstrates that we cannot close this gap only with public money. That's the whole point of sustainable finance, to mobilize private money. Under the first objective, we have proposed several actions. One of them, which is very important, is taxonomy, and there will be a specific presentation by Nancy on that. The second objective that we have defined is mainstreaming sustainability in the way how financial institutions and financial sector manages their own risk. This is very important. This is not only about financial sector, but also how supervisors take those risks into considerations. And the third objective is fostering transparency and promoting long-termism. Here we talk about enhancing disclosure requirements for institutional investors and asset managers. There we have also proposed a very important legislative proposal, and also disclosure by the corporates. We also have noted that we need to engage also with the corporates. If we want the financial sector to do their job properly, we also need that corporates disclose appropriate information. So this is one of the work streams that we are now pursuing under the technical expert group. The action plan, as I mentioned, is a very ambitious one. Many of these actions need to be finalized already next year. We have prioritized climate sustainability, given the urgency. Let me just recall very quickly, I have been given 7.5 minutes, just to recall what the three legislative proposals that the European Commission adopted in March are. The first one is a legislative proposal on creating a legal framework for taxonomy. When I say legal, it might scare many stakeholders and many people are anxious about it. What we are trying to do with taxonomy in the first place is to create a tool, is to create a useful tool for those investors who would like to make a difference and to scale up their green finance. We have prioritized climate, and the goal is to have the first taxonomy on climate by the end of 2019, and colleagues who are actually sitting on the panel, including Molly in one way, are actually working very hard to have it done. The second proposal, which is also important, is to create a separate category on a low carbon benchmark, which will be another tool that we believe would be very useful for investors, especially for those who are very keen on pursuing low carbon strategies, and to have an appropriate tool that would also allow them to measure the performance of their investments against. The third proposal is about disclosure. Here we talk about the fiduciary duties and the requirement for institutional investors and asset managers to disclose how they comply with those duties, and also those investors who claim that they pursue sustainable strategies to disclose the impact of those strategies. Finally, this is a proposal that the college is going to adopt in coming weeks. This is a very important measure for us. This is about investment advisors asking preferences of their clients, and whether, by the way, there is also a preference for environmental, social, and governance factors. These are the kind of four big legislative actions. As I mentioned, if you look at our action plan, and I do recommend you to read it, those of you who have not read it, there are many other actions. And that also, kind of opens the floor for the next panel, which will also explore different national initiatives and the national roadmaps, different initiatives taken by the private sector, like the one we have seen yesterday from the banking sector. So we are very much we very much appreciate all those initiatives that go in the direction that we set out. Finally, this is my final slide. We set up a Commission's technical expert group. Why did we so? Because we wanted to engage with the private sector even more closely than what we have done until now. We wanted to continue an excellent work relationship that we have created in Europe between the public sector, us bureaucrats, and the experts that are working on those issues on the ground on a daily basis. And we believe that in the European Union we have a competitive edge. The high-level expert group was a very good example of this cooperation, and we are very keen on continuing this cooperation. This technical expert group will help us to design the substance of all these proposals, and in addition, also to develop a standard for a green bond for which Ayla Aho from Nordea is responsible and is the rapporteur of the subgroup. So here I just would like to recall the four subgroups that we have created: the taxonomy subgroup, the subgroup on the EU green bond standard, the low carbon benchmark subgroup, and also a subgroup that will help us to develop a metric for corporate that is related to the climate related information. The work of this mandate is supposed to finish in June. I don't like the possible extension by the end of the year 2019. The group will deliver by June, I'm sure. I will stop here. Absolutely. I think that with this project, the European Commission and the EU obviously does have the ambition to lead on the sustainable finance, not only on sustainability, also globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Very good. Molly, what do the people of Europe think about this reform?
Yes, that's my job, isn't it, to bring the popular perspective in here. And I will cover some of the turf that Martin just covered, but I hope from a slightly more popular and probably less expert point of view. We all kind of meet up in different European cities, so it's lovely to be in Paris, but we're a little bit like one of those strange supergroups now, aren't we? We keep bumping into each other. And it's always my job to say what a great job I think the Commission is doing, because I think they're showing fantastic leadership here. And obviously as a green politician and somebody who used to be a green economist, I'm really excited and pleased to see the way we're now bringing together insights into ecology and the environment with expertise on economics and finance to address this really most important issue of climate change, and then the other environmental crises as well. So to come back to your question, Nathan, I think the people of Europe are ready for more ambitious action on climate change. I think, obviously, from a political point of view, we're seeing strong votes now for Green parties, particularly in Northern Europe. And I think after the summer we had, and after some of the extraordinary climate events we're seeing, there's no longer any argument about the need for urgent action on climate change. And sustainable finance is an important part of the policy framework there. I think I'll just make a few political points, framing points really, for how I see this expert group's work and how I see the action plan developing, and then just a little bit of detail on the various proposals that Martin outlined from the Parliament's point of view. So I think the first important thing to say is that public money and private money are both important here. I mean, we've lived through, particularly in Britain, a number of years where we had extraordinary squeeze on public spending and cuts to public spending. And to me, it seems clear that the sort of investment you're talking about, the enormous numbers that we need to ensure the sustainability transition, will require considerable public investment. And it would be absurd to not address climate change, you know, in terms of the damage that will do if we don't address it, just because you think that you can't find the public money. So that's an important part of the agenda. And also public banking, and we'll hear from Nancy next, who's from the EIB, so that's an important part as well. But what we're mostly talking about today is about shifting private finance. So the money is already doing something. The point is, at the moment, a lot of it is invested in activities that are really quite destructive. And so, as I see it, a lot of the sustainable finance proposals we're working on at the moment are to create incentives for people to shift their money away from destructive activities and towards sustainable and constructive activities. So the job for us as politicians really is to give very clear signals to market players that that's what we're expecting them to do. And we already have voted in the European Parliament to phase out fossil fuels by the middle of the century. To my way of thinking, that's nothing like fast enough. But nonetheless, that already gives a clear signal about the value of fossil-related assets, that they are declining and that within, 30 years and a bit, they will no longer have value. So what we need to do is to give that clear signal and to give clear timeframes to allow people to dispose of assets as they become stranded and to move into more sustainable assets. Because we want to make sure this transition is orderly, and but at the same time, we make the necessary shifts away from fossil fuels fast enough to tackle climate change. So that's one of the challenges of sustainable finance. And I think another one is to convince both the industry players and the finance players that we are serious, that we are, as politicians, determined to tackle climate change, because otherwise, we will see people not responding to those incentives. So part of my job is always to say, yes, we have taken this seriously, and that's why it's really good to have the support both of President Macron and of Dombrovskis as well, them giving a very clear political signal that we are going to address these issues. And I think the other item that's really important is that we need to think, are we dealing here with a niche, or are we dealing with mainstream finance? Because we can create incentives that encourage a certain small proportion of pension holders or particularly green investors to buy a certain type of asset. But that's actually not the main purpose here. The main purpose is to shift the whole of the economy towards the direction of sustainability. And you'll see when I talk about the detailed proposals, that does change really how we would address these specific issues. So, as Martin said, the Parliament's already made some significant progress on the file about disclosures. We passed that through our committee 10 days ago, and we'll be voting it in December in the plenary of the Parliament, and then we'll move into negotiations with the Council and the Commission. So, the changes that we made in the Parliament were really to extend the scope for disclosures. So we included investee companies, credit institutions, and really the whole range of financial services. And I think that was essential to ensure that there could actually be a competitive marketplace between all the different players in that market. We've also built on the Commission's definition of what sustainability means by inserting references to all the ESG factors, so taking social and governance factors as seriously as environmental factors. So I agree with the Commission's approach, which is that we need to start with climate because that's the most urgent, but we mustn't ignore the ES&G, the environmental, social and governance factors, and most importantly, we mustn't allow our action on climate to then cause negative spillovers onto those other factors. So if you think about what happened with biofuels, that was an idea, oh look, great idea, let's make sure that we use less fossil fuels by using plant-based fuels. But that was actually a catastrophe in terms of the environment because all we did was cut down rainforests that were absorbing carbon and turn them into palm oil plantations. So it's a good example of how if you don't take the whole system into account, you risk having these very negative spillovers. And then we also made significant additions on the due diligence and transparency risk policies. So we suggested that as well as financial that financial market participants had to have due diligence policies in place to assess sustainability risks. So I would say we took what was a good proposal and we sort of broadened the scope and the remit, and we wait to see what will finally be agreed during the negotiations. And then on the benchmarks file, as Martin said, we should be closing our negotiations for the Parliament tomorrow on that one. And here the aim is to shift a large amount of finance actually fairly rapidly, because if we can, a lot of investors, as you know, are passive investors. So if there's an index that is a sustainable index, then that money will follow the companies in that index. And so if we can define these indices well and these benchmarks well, then we can really see large sums of long-term money shifting towards much more positive investments. And again here, I mean, the proposals from the Commission were that they had a low carbon benchmark and a positive carbon benchmark. Now, we agree about the low carbon benchmark, but we weren't terribly comfortable with the idea of positive carbon, and we also think that there might not be very many companies in that benchmark. So what we're proposing is that instead we have a carbon transition benchmark. And the purpose of that, to go back to what I was saying earlier, is also that we shift the companies that are in the middle here. We don't, if you create a low carbon benchmark, effectively you're attracting companies that are already very green. And that's, to my mind, not the most important job here. The most important job here is to encourage the companies that aren't already sustainable and that are already producing a lot of carbon emissions to move in a more sustainable direction. So that's what we're trying to create with this idea of a carbon transition benchmark. But again, we'll be waiting to see how that's greeted by the other co-legislators. So I think Martin and his team have set us a very ambitious schedule, and I think that's correct because these are very urgent issues. I haven't mentioned the taxonomy because I know Nancy's going to be talking about that, but that's also, of course, a vital part of this agenda. We're determined to get these first two pieces finished. I've got to get them finished by March because of Brexit, unless I can stop it. But anyway, we need to get at least those two through before the end of the mandate, and with the following wind, we'll also get the taxonomy through. So we need just as much ambition to be shown by the Council than has been shown by the Commission and the Parliament. Thank you.
That's great, Molly. Thank you. On behalf of all of us, thank you for all of your work. Okay, so Nancy, you are slugging it out on the taxonomy design. So tell us where we're up to and what our audience can expect to see soon.
Okay, well, thank you very much for asking me to come and talk about the taxonomy. It is a very hard-working group. Nathan's keeping us well on track. But before I go into what we're doing and what you might be interested to know is happening next, I want to just start by talking about what is the taxonomy and why do we need it. Basically, it's a list. In a very simple form, it's a list. And if those of you ever go into the HLEG documents and look in the additional unofficial annexes, you'll find a first proposal for a mitigation taxonomy, which was done as part of the HLEG work. We are trying to build as much as possible on things that had been done before, international definitions of climate finance. But the main aim here is to make sure that it's usable by people around the world in different capital markets so that it's translatable and understandable by people who are either investors or issuers of bonds or other players in the capital markets around the world. So it needs to address the problem where if everybody starts making their own lists, we end up with market fragmentation. I think it's important to highlight that just because something isn't in the list doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. I'll come back to that later. It may be at some point when we finally get to the far right-hand end of all the objectives that the HLEG proposed, we may then have written down everything that we want to keep in our economy that might be sustainable. And then you might be able to say, well, anything that's not on any of these lists, we don't really want to finance. But right now, I think it is important to bear in mind that these are the things for climate, and things that are not in the list are not necessarily bad things. They're just things for financing with other purposes. I'll come back to that. So how are we working on this? Well, first of all, there are some very important things in the draft legislation which it's important to take note of. One is that whatever is in the taxonomy has to substantially contribute to one of the environmental objectives. There are 6 of them, and you can see them there. The first 2, as Martin said, are about climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Now then, to define what's in the list, you don't just need a list of activities, because most of the time the activities are not by themselves mitigation. They're an activity within which you can find mitigation. And therefore you need a criteria to decide whether something is going to be counted or not. Now this might be an exclusion, it might be a numerical indicator, a threshold, it could be yes, no. There are many different types of ways that you could decide whether an activity should be on the list or not. But fundamentally, it must substantially contribute. I think it's important to highlight this because all new things are more efficient than old things, otherwise they're a really bad idea. So this doesn't necessarily help us avoid dangerous global warming. We have to really change the path we're on, and therefore mitigation is not everything that is Paris-aligned. I think it's important to say that. Mitigation is supposed to be the things that are really helping with this transition to low-carbon economies. And adaptation are supposed to be the activities that really address dealing with climate change impacts. So I emphasize the word change. It's not just things that deal with climate. We have a lot of those. You could say umbrellas deal with climate. Doesn't make them climate change adaptation unless someone thinks that we need much, much stronger umbrellas to deal with more severe rainfall. Haven't really thought about that one, but maybe. Anyway, so those are the two categories. The other four will be dealt with in 1 year and 2 years' time. However, while we're looking at this, we have to, in our taxonomy work, ensure that anything we're putting in the list is also not going to significantly harm the other objectives. In other words, we do not want to be counting something as mitigation or adaptation if it's significantly harming biodiversity, if it's significantly polluting. We don't want to be building something or counting something as adaptation if it's actually undermining the mitigation activity, the mitigation objective. And I think that's quite important because you hear a lot of people talking about green things, and when it cannot be counted as mitigation, sometimes people say, well, it's good for clean air, isn't it? We'll count it as green. The thing that this taxonomy does, which is really important, is it makes a link across the objectives. You can't count something as green if it's undermining one of the other objectives. This is a long list of important aspects about the taxonomy. I'm just going to pick out one or two. The first thing is to say that this is a global market that we're dealing with, so we have to think about the fact that decarbonization pathways are different for different parts of the world. Therefore, we're going to have to think, and we are thinking, about whether the criteria can be the same globally, or whether it depends on whether where the industry is at the moment, to take Molly's point about transition in high-emitting industries. It depends where you're starting from. This list has to be dynamic because as technologies change, things that we were counting 5 or 10 years ago are perhaps no longer mitigation. For example, if we go back some time, we might have been counting energy efficiency in conventional internal combustion engine. It's very unlikely that most people would be counting that because we have another technology now which people would be prioritizing. I think it's important to say a word which isn't on this list, and that is ambition. By the time this list gets into law and is being used, the technologies will have moved on again. So it's very important that the taxonomy group is really showing ambition in what it's including in the list, because we do not want it to be out of date as soon as it comes into play. Nevertheless, it has to exist for a certain number of years. The markets cannot handle a list which is changing every 6 months. So we have to think about something that's going to be fit for purpose for a number of years. And the last point is very important. It comes back to what I said. Not everything that's not counted as climate finance is necessarily brown or bad for climate. And one of the problems we have with just defining climate is sometimes people do put everything else into the same pot. I give you an example. Education is not the same as coal-fired power station, but neither of them would be on the mitigation list. So just leave you with that thought on that point. So what's happening now? Well, what's happening is we've been asked by the member states to accelerate a first group of climate mitigation activities. We did some analysis as to what sectors we should focus on. And am I allowed to say what they are?
Not yet.
Oh, no, I'm not allowed to say. Okay, you have to watch this space for, as it says, early in December, which is, I can tell you, next week. So, yep, there are 5 big sectors, and we've worked very hard, and there will be consultation on those. There will be also consultation on the usability of the taxonomy, the way that it's being presented with its criteria for feedback on whether or not it is useful for all the different players that need to use it. Now, the 5 big activities in the first group are by no means all the important sectors. So we will be at the same time calling for further expertise to support us on second round activities in mitigation, that means not the 5 sectors, but other sectors, and adaptation. One of the reasons why we need to do that is because adaptation, as defined in the draft regulation, is a case and location specific list. In other words, it's not a list. And that's challenging, and we realize that we need more adaptation expertise. And despite the great expertise in the TEG, we're really going to need sector adaptation experts to come in and help us with that. So this is just a nice graphic to show you how the timing is going to work out. As you can see, we will be delivering by June, Martin. It says so on this slide that Nathan made, and he's in charge, so that's what we're going to be doing. But you can see that we will have some open consultation finishing in early February, so you should be watching for next week, and you should be aiming to providing this input on the use of the taxonomy and the first round activities by that time. And the other work with the technical experts will go on longer because these are more challenging sectors. So I think I'll stop there.
That's great, Nancy. Thank you very much. Now, it's important to note that the taxonomy is a list of economic activities, but to create financial instruments, then you need to have some reference to the taxonomy. And one of the main financial instruments that will refer to the taxonomy is the green bonds approach that's also being worked on in the TEG. And we're lucky to have Isla here, who's the rapporteur for that group, to tell us what they're doing.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and talk to you. Actually, the temperature here reminds me of last summer. It is very, very warm, much warmer than on that side. Anyway, it's not a surprise to anybody if I also say that we inherited a very good template from the HLEG to create a green bond standard. And indeed, we are using that in our work, and also, of course, the very good work done by the Green Bond Principles and Climate Bond Initiative. This market has often been called by being nascent, and I think we are approaching a kindergarten, if not an elementary school, and that means that we are going to need a little bit of more structure, and that is what we are here to develop. It's good to remember that our work or report will be ready next June, and thereafter the Commission will make their conclusions and potential action. This will be different than the other subgroups. Our ambition in the subgroup is to create a standard that would be based on the current best practice on the market. It should be within a reasonable reach for all players, although not currently applied by everybody. In fact, I would say that the market has shown a remarkable capacity to take on new practices and guidance in reporting and verification, which actually means that these measures are seen as value added. We hope this is going to be the same for the standard. Green bonds as an instrument, they have brought a real novelty to the debt market, and they have showed that what this a lot talked about transparency actually means in practice, and what are the steps needed to make it happen. It is actually very important, and all treasurers, if you talk to any who have gone through the green bonds exercise, say that it has been a very powerful learning exercise for the organization. This should not be underestimated, because we all need to learn to talk the language of sustainability in the financial institutions as well as the market at large. So there's a consensus that among issuers and investors that we need a transparent and comparable information. Otherwise, we cannot really drive for the actions to get the low carbon economy. So we need a frame and we need rules. There's a good discussion ongoing on how to integrate ESG into the credit risk and return models. Indeed, our bank's research guys did actually quite good work on that. And the conclusion is that actually the what we still call non-financial information in the reporting, actually has an impact on the financial returns and the performance of the financial instruments, shares and bonds. So less risk, less volatility, and better returns. Can it be true? But this, what we are talking about now in the taxonomy, is more about what the company actually does. What is its business models? How does it use the money that is raised from the markets? And what are the environmental impacts of that money? So we should not mix these two. Quite often they coincide, but not always. So the taxonomy will give us better confidence and clarify what can be considered as green. It also will provide a good beacon for the corporate strategists who are thinking what should they strive for in the future, what is a future-proof business model. This is also very important, especially for the corporate market. It is no surprise, of course, that if I say that, when I say that our subgroup will take the taxonomy as a starting point for the green bond standard. It has to be aligned with the environmental objectives and the taxonomy criteria. Otherwise, it will still include the 4 familiar pillars that we all know from the green bond principles. We are working a little bit to perhaps clarify some of the technical issues, perhaps simplify if we can or where possible. We are also considering strengthening the importance of reporting, and definitely including the impact reporting, as well as the verification process. We are thinking currently that we should have one template that would fit all issuers, listed, non-listed, public, private, so that we can have a simple and level playing field for all. We are also targeting to reach out to the market participants to identify real or perceived market barriers, and then try to identify potential ways to move these. Another important factor are the linkages with the rest of the financial market. Lending is still more than 70% of financing in Europe, and therefore the harmonization needs to cover both sides, lending and bonds. Otherwise, it will not be helpful. And the fragmentation is something that we are trying to get rid of. This is also important for creating efficient evaluation and revaluation reporting processes, because eventually all these processes will be performed by artificial intelligence. So it needs to be simple. We aim to have this template with the key content ready sometime next spring, and then we will bring it out to you and you can give your feedback on that. That will be sometime in February, March. It's also important when we are talking about transparency to bring to the market and make visible the parts that are already green but have not been labeled green yet. Why is that important? 2 things. It's good to show to the market among this discussion that it's urgent need, we have to start, we have to go on, and climate change is putting us all in jeopardy, humans as well as economies, that we already have workable solutions. And we do not have to wait, we can start already now. Don't sit on your hands or our hands and wait for technical innovations. We can start now. The second point is again a practical one. The financial institutions would really benefit from the sophisticated data platforms that could manage the qualitative and location-specific information and aspects. This is currently not the case. This is needed for risk assessment and also for the impact reporting. And that is actually the impacts are the key target that we need to be able to make informed decisions. Only then can we do proper training of staff and system upgrades. So we really need the rules and clear frameworks also to get these systems upgrade. That is a long-term exercise as such. All this work on sustainable finance is important, enhance transparency, common sector-specific frameworks and related metrics. but it will not replace the actions required to be done both on policy side and also by the industries themselves in creating sustainable investment targets. At the moment, there's more demand than supply, and that should worry all of us quite a lot. So sustainable finance is where to help and to accelerate, but it's not enough on its own. One more point, last one. I think that the sustainable finance and especially the consideration of impact is a great opportunity for our industry, financial sector, to understand and to describe the connection we have with the real economy, environment and the society by using a language that our stakeholders understand and talking about issues that they really care for. This should be very much in our interest. So thank you.
Thank you, Ayla. Okay, now we're thinking there are probably a lot of questions in the audience. So if you have one, I'm going to ask Martin a quick question, but get ready to stick your hand up in just a minute. Martin, can you just tell everyone the intended uses of the taxonomy in the legislation quickly? And can people start raising their hands if you have? Okay, great. Yep, go for it.
Thank you, Nathan. I will try to be short. As I mentioned, the reason why we embarked on creating the taxonomy at the EU level was to provide a tool, a useful tool for the investors. So actually we didn't want to start with a very heavy legislative requirement for investors saying you have to only invest in those assets that will be then on the taxonomy list, or that will companies that will engage in the activities that will be on the taxonomy list. That's the desire, but we have never proposed that investors would be required to invest in those companies and would have to divest from certain companies. What we have done is that those institutional investors and asset managers who claim that they pursue environmentally sustainable strategies and they market products as such, that they would have to disclose to what extent they have been using the taxonomy. But again, if institutional investors and asset managers decide that they have other strategies in place that, again, they believe are sufficiently and substantially contributing to meeting environmental objectives, they would have to disclose how they do it themselves if they don't use taxonomy. So again, we have started with this disclosure requirement, not behavioral requirement. I say this is the first step. We did consider going even further, but that would not be in the spirit of creating the right incentives and the right tools for investors to move in that space if they want.
Good, thank you. Now, we're going to try and take a few questions at one time. There's two in the middle here, so please, can I ask the person with the microphone and the gentleman in the white shirt, grab the mic straight after. We'll take two, and then stick your hands up if you have them. Yes, please.
Thank you. Liz from Banktrack. My question is directed maybe more specifically to Nancy. You're talking about the European Investment Bank's climate ambition, which is really good to hear. But we also know that the EIB is one of the major investors in the transatlantic pipeline. So I wanted to maybe ask you, how do you see the consistency between the EIB's climate ambition and investment into new fossil fuel infrastructure such as TAP? Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And the second question here, and please keep your hands raised. It will help us get a microphone to you.
Hi, Shranjit Padam, QBE. Just one quick comment. Well done for spotting that we actually want to finance the people who are changing rather than the people who are good already. I say that from a point of view about climate justice, where developing nations perhaps aren't doing so well on those measures, and then if we're not careful, we can just drive finance into emerging nations. So that's a comment. The second question is, how are you going to ensure that lobbying doesn't lead to industries that shouldn't be on the list becoming on the list? What processes have you in place to ensure that doesn't happen?
All right, thank you. We'll start with Nancy first, and someone can think about the second one, and then we'll start with those answers. Nancy, if you're ready, go for it, and we'll prepare the next ones.
Okay, so yes, I mean, on any list, whether it's a bank list or the EU's taxonomy list, you have transition activities. Now, there are many people that argue, using scientific information, that certain kinds of fossil fuels are less emitting than other fossil fuels. Actually, there's a lot of information about that. It depends where they come from. So in terms of the new gas pipeline that you're talking about, this is an EU priority project. It is actually going to be a source of gas which is much less emitting than other sources of gas that the EU might use. Demand for gas in the EU is actually dropping. So the question is, why would you need that? Well, maybe you only need it for a short while. So one of the things we did at the bank was test it against a very short economic life. We tested it against a 15-year economic life, and it was still a viable project, largely because it is, in fact, much less emitting, much less leakage of methane. I'm not saying that that's something we will continue doing. I think it's important to see that any taxonomy transition activities do change over time. But currently, it was an EU priority project that, yes, we financed. And I think that is a link to what the other gentleman was asking about transition. And I was trying to cover that when I mentioned about it depending where you're starting from. So it is important that we prioritize mitigation in all sectors, including high-emitting sectors. The taxonomy will have things in it which are about, you might call them the end game, the solutions that we currently at least think will be part of the low-carbon solution, although those themselves may change over time. We may find better ways of doing things. But nevertheless, there will be other things which are about reducing emissions from certain activities. Eventually, some of those things may disappear off the taxonomy list altogether, but right now they are really, really important activities. And that may depend indeed on what country you're in, and developing countries may need a slightly different starting point because indeed their economies are in a different place from perhaps some of the more developed countries.
Thanks, Nancy. So Molly wants to comment on the gas pipeline, I think, and then Martin will talk about
I'm
lobbying.
just pleased somebody asked about the gas pipeline, because usually it's me asking Nancy about that, and I didn't have to today. And I don't actually buy the argument about lock-in, but Nancy and I are still friends, so that's okay. About your point, yes, I think the transition is vitally important, but of course we also have to make sure we don't end up with greenwashing. So we're not having companies saying, I'm making this transition, where actually they don't have anything to prove that. So we've got to balance the transition with, very strict, scientifically robust measurements of the improvements that they are making. On lobbying, of course, this is a perennial problem. Fossil fuel lobbying, and particularly lobbying, I think, by some of the German heavy industries, heavy carbon industries, and the car industry. Obviously, the best thing we can do is make it more transparent. And I think we might also look for actual controls on lobbying. But at the moment, it's not clear who's talking to whom. And I think that's really problematic. And it's also not clear, apart from to us, who's voting in favour of what on some of this agenda. And I think it's clear that the voters, as I said earlier, want more robust and swift action on climate change, but sometimes they don't understand that the way their representatives vote is in the opposite direction. And I think that there needs to be that clarity for that democratic pressure to support us in what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Molly. Just quickly on lobbying, Martin.
Nathan, for once I will try to be helpful to you. all those of you, who would like to lobby, please contact me. Those of you who would like to provide technical expertise and concrete, specific, useful input to the work of tech, contact Nathan.
Excellent, perfect, thank you. Yes, there's a woman in the middle here, and then there's one up the back there. Please go ahead.
I'm Luciane Moesa, I'm from Brazil, from Sustainable Inclusive Solutions. My question is, I think it should be addressed by Nancy and Molly, probably, and maybe Martin too. Basically, it regards the social impacts of green projects. There is a specific article in the proposal of directive that mentions the 8 main ILO conventions, right? And in my opinion, there's a very important one that was forgotten. It's Convention 169 regarding indigenous tribes, indigenous and tribal people. Maybe you forgot them because you were in Europe, but European banks and investors operate globally, and all the other continents still have indigenous and tribal people. So that's my question. I've made a suggestion, the public consultation in August, by the way. I just would like to be if these issues are already being considered.
Good, thank you. And the second question up here, and then we'll move the microphones around.
from Spain. Next year, European citizens are called for European Parliament elections, and a new commission will be elected. So I want to know if this, how this will affect the roadmap that has already been disclosed and the ambitious calendar, and will this affect somehow the plan, or how? I mean, I want to know if this will affect somehow the commitment and the speed of the roadmap.
Very good. We'll take answers on those two. Please.
Lady from Brazil, there you are. I'm totally with you over this. If I didn't lobby for that, then that's just because I didn't notice. So next time, please lobby me. I'm on the Brazilian delegation in the Parliament. I meet people all the time whose human rights have been abused, and in some cases the relatives of people who've been murdered purely for defending their land rights. And this is why I mentioned the issue of spillovers in connection with biofuels, because at the moment, if we don't focus enough on all the social aspects, and the ILO conventions and Rule 169 is a very important aspect of that, then we will indeed see us achieving our climate targets by displacing onto other people's social rights and their land and their ability to coexist. So please come back to me on that. I also think, incidentally, that we have a great deal to learn about sustainability from Indigenous people. On the point about elections, I've found that this agenda has been surprisingly unpolitical compared to others. That's not 100% true, but I mean, there's much more consensus across the Parliament than on most of the issues I work on, because it's in nobody's interest. It isn't a left-right issue whether you want human life on the planet to survive, really, is it? So I would like to think this is going to benefit us as Greens, but honestly, I think it's much better if all the political parties are signed up to it, and my sense is that they are, but I'll let Martin maybe talk a little bit more about what plans they've got in place to make sure this doesn't get lost.
Just a quick one, Martin, if you can.
Well, what the next commission will do, I cannot say now, but I do expect that the agenda of sustainability and sustainable finance will only accelerate. I can confirm that all the commitments that the European Commission made in its ambitious action plan, which is for me action plan number 1, will stay, and we will deliver. I mean, most of the commitments that we have announced are actually supposed to be delivered by the end of next year. I mentioned taxonomy and climate, many other actions, and we are well on track so far. And I am really being encouraged by the great and excellent progress achieved also in the technical expert group. So, I mean, don't have a single doubt about the Commission slowing down on its efforts. On the contrary, we are already preparing a list of ideas and list of issues that we will have ready for the next Commission, for the next Commissioner who will come in autumn. And when he asks me what more do we need to do, well, we will have some answers and menu of options.
Nancy, we have 1 minute to answer this, and we have 1 minute for one question. That's it. I'm sorry.
I just want to add something to the points that were made. On the social standards, it links very closely to what I said about this being a global market. So the TEG is seriously thinking about this, because indeed, in the market already, there are projects in financial instruments being sold in Europe, and the projects are in many parts of the world. So we do have to think about all those things. The last thing I would say about the link to the long-term plan is that when the TEG has finished with mitigation and adaptation, and it has been through the legal system, we will have defined climate finance for the EU. And therefore, I do not think that there will be a possibility of the two things going separately. As they change over time and transition, they will need to be intertwined.
Good, thank you. Can it be quick, please?
Linked to this last point, checking on European Banking Federation, we fully support this initiative, of course. Maybe more for Martin, do you see any interest or scope for other regions in the world taking up the European standard? Because I remember in the past there was interest from other regions, for instance in MiFID. Are you now going to be the standard for this in the region, in the world? Thank you.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. As I said, the European Commission and in the EU, and we are in Paris, in France, where also, I mean, major progress has been done. We do have an ambition to lead on the sustainable finance, but we are not the only ones, fortunately. We also, I mean, have obviously our Chinese friends and stakeholders who are progressing their agenda very, very quickly. We also have established quite close relationship with other key stakeholders, those willing jurisdictions for the time being, and we intend to reach out even to more jurisdictions. So it's too early to say what exactly we will do, but we do have an intention to reinforce international cooperation and exchange among the different jurisdictions where the sustainable finance is very high on the agenda. Why? Because many of you have a global business. And it would be very unfortunate if we end up with a framework, global framework, where actually there will be different segmented taxonomies, different standards. That would make your life, I mean, those of you from the financial sector and also those of you from the businesses, very, very difficult.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, in a moment, I'll get you to thank the panelists, but please, next week, we will publish our first thinking. Use the opportunity. We've tried to create a very open process for the taxonomy work going forward. So you'll have the chance to provide comments online, and if you are an individual or you know someone who is technically competent in the issues we're dealing with, you will have an opportunity to contribute. So please use that opportunity. We look forward to all of your feedback, and if you would, please thank our very hard-working panel.